Phil, why don't you begin? Tell us about your experience.
Sure. Um, well, I was diagnosed with ALS in August of 2018 at the age of 48. ALS is a diagnosis with no hope, and there are no FDA approved therapies that are truly disease modifying for ALS. And our only hope is really with the investigational therapies that are in clinical trials. I was fortunate enough to qualify for a clinical trial in early 2019. So I got my chance at hope. But most people with ALS aren't so lucky. There are around 30,000 people living with ALS in the US at any given time, with about 6,000 people diagnosed each year and about 6,000 passing away. There are less than 2,000 clinical trial slots. We like to call them seats on the bus, which means we're leaving behind about 28,000 people on the curb with no seat and therefore no chance at hope. Part of the problem we have in ALS is ALS has no validated diagnostic biomarker or biomarker for disease progression. And getting an ALS diagnosis often takes a year or even longer. Now, keep in mind that clinical trials typically deem someone ineligible after 24 months from symptom onset in ALS. So you can imagine a delayed diagnosis has a significant impact on someone's ability to get access through a clinical trial. The lack of progression biomarkers forces clinical trials to exclude patients whose disease progression is too slow, meaning it would be too difficult to see any therapeutic effect over a 6 or 9 month trial. Unlike diseases like HIV and cancer, EAPs in ALS have been the rare exception and not the rule. In fact, we call them a unicorn. That is starting to change thanks to strong advocacy efforts by my friends like Sandy Morris. We have learned from EAP experts like Greg Gonzalez and others from other disease indications so we can bring that knowledge to our disease community on how best to implement EAPs for ALS. We are now starting to see sponsors support small EAPs of 5, 10, 20, but keep in mind that's better than zero. The biggest problem we see is that most companies are pre-revenue and have limited resources. Their primary focus, understandably, has to be executing a successful clinical trial, and EAPs are viewed as a distraction from that end goal. We are working hard to change that thinking and present sponsors with evidence that it is their best interest to understand how their therapies work in a broader population. It could help with labeling and payer acceptance down the road. With the recent signing of the Act for ALS bill into law, HHS will now supply grants to help fund larger EAPs for for ALS. We are hoping to see EAPs in the hundreds and someday in the thousands. Capturing some basic data on these larger populations should be possible with this new funding channel. There's so much to learn about the broader population, the other 90+% that aren't in trials, that we can get from their participation in EAPs. I even suggest that maybe we should start calling EAPs expanded access studies to reinforce the capability to capture data and collect information from this important access. All right, let's get back to talking about me. I received an investigational therapy under EAP at the beginning of 2021, and comprehensive data was collected that I anticipate the sponsor will use as evidence to supplement their upcoming BLA submission to the FDA. I am living proof that giving hope through expanded access can coexist with collecting valuable evidence. All right, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you so much, Phil. And I'm sure we'll come back. There'll be some questions about that experience and navigating access to existing trials and understanding from that ALS community perspective what you think the new legislation will really do. But thank you very much. Jinsy.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me, Phil. It was really nice to hear your experience as well. And as a clinician, I've had experience treating people living with ALS and doing clinical trials for over 15 years now. And the evolution in the field is really driven by what's been available for access and how unsuccessful our clinical trials have been. When I first entered, it was just riluzole and maybe 1 or 2 clinical trials at best at a time. And in the last decade, we did even one of the largest phase 3 clinical trials, which had almost 1,000 participants in a phase 3, and that was not enough slots. So there were still potentially eligible patients and many that were not eligible who wanted access to that particular investigational drug that couldn't, and really highlighted the importance of access. Access for me, from my perspective, is an important one because it doesn't pertain only to just investigational drugs, but it also pertains to optimal standard of care. So trying to make sure that anyone who's diagnosed with ALS gets to a specialty center as quickly as possible and it's accessible to them. As Phil mentioned, there's a diagnostic delay. And if there's time lost in getting to that ALS center, you lose an opportunity to participate in a clinical trial. It is very difficult, not only for the person living with the disease, but also as a healthcare provider. It's hard. And the other aspect is trying to gain access to multidisciplinary care. And the reason why I emphasize those 2 points first is because getting to an ALS center quickly and having that access provides an opportunity to discuss already FDA approved or any drug that's approved in that region for the treatment, because that has evidence that's been built up, whether we believe it to be strong or not, it was sufficient to meet regulatory approval, and trying to get that on board first. What a lot of people don't realize is that when you want to participate in a clinical trial, often those approved therapies are allowed, but you have to be on them before you enroll in a clinical trial. Of course, after all of those, we try to talk about clinical trials. And as Phil mentioned, many of them, even more recently, some of the gene-directed clinical trials, there were less spots than there were people who were eligible, even at my own center. And that created a lot of hardship and discussions about how to be equitable about access. And it's tough for people living with the disease, but it's also tough as a healthcare provider because we're caught in the middle between the pharmaceutical sponsor that has limited spots and the bulk of patients who want to participate. And often it is an emotional struggle, it's a psychological struggle, but really we're struggling with the concept of equity of access and fairness. And that's why I am a proponent of trying to build an expanded access component to investigational drugs that have shown some degree of safety and is reasonable to employ in a population of people living with the disease that may not have access. Phil made an important point where not many people have access to clinical trials. So there are people that want to participate and provide data, provide samples, maybe even provide clinical outcomes that we just lose an opportunity for. And where I felt it, so I have had experience working both in the academic setting. I've also did a stint on the industry side and then came back to academics. And on the industry side, we want to be as respectful to the patient population as possible. So we try to create shorter durations, more likelihood of getting treatment versus placebo, and then trying to provide open label extensions if that's possible. And when we did those things, and I tried to employ those things from the industry setting, often if we wanted to use that additional data, there was not enough information available about people more advanced in their disease to use as even historical controls as supportive data to the primary clinical trial. So I really felt the impact of that lost, quote unquote, lost data. But when we're offering expanded access and in ALS, it's difficult because from a site perspective, there are a few challenges, and some of that I think is what the Act for ALS has tried to accomplish in trying to fill that gap. But one of the things from my perspective is that if expanded access is offered, trying to be fair in who gets it, right? So drug companies will, if they are able to provide it, will provide it, but how many patients will they let me provide that to? Where geographically will they allow it? And will that create inequity so that the people that can travel to my center get it first rather than the people who have no resources or caregivers to bring them to my center? So that equity of access is very important. And the struggle between trying to address a population today, historically, the ALS community has tried to participate in clinical trials and hope that we learn more about the biology, and therefore our clinical trials will become more successful and more impactful. And the drive, I believe, this is a personal opinion, for this expanded access is really that we haven't been successful in our clinical trials. And the thing is, people say, oh, well, that's because you haven't learned enough about the biology. And I get a little frustrated because we've learned a lot. And the truth is, the more we learn about ALS, the more we realize we don't know. And the reason is that we've learned that ALS is really different from person to person. There's different subpopulations, and we learned that from actually our failed clinical trials. And so this is where I think ALS might differentiate itself from other disease states, where expanded access, access, as I understand it, has been really for treatment, not necessarily for research purposes. But the two scenarios of where we learn more biology as we study patients in a formal manner, and providing that expanded access so that we learn more about patients who are more advanced can help actually, I think, in the long run, to support some of the clinical trials and maybe even provide additional data to broaden a label. So I think there's an opportunity there. The bigger question is, when we offer this, I've talked to many people who want to do anything, clinical trial or expanded access, whichever way they can use an experimental therapy. And one of the questions I can't answer because I'm not the person living with it is, people will say, I'm willing to take the risk. But what risk is understood? And so there are people saying, okay, fine, ALS is a deadly disease. And if we've talked about the risks and benefits, I want to try it because I can make that decision. And I want to respect their autonomy. But at the same token, I have to also be a responsible physician and ensure their safety. And so that balance is sometimes difficult. And also trying to ensure that I'm not creating a false hope, right? So that, I'm realistic about how it's going to help them. And whether, I asked a person, I said, if you try this experimental therapy and it doesn't do anything at all, is that going to negatively impact you? And most people say no. I just want the chance to try. A few will say, well, I kind of want to know whether you think this is going to work or not. And the reality is, an investigational drug, we really don't know whether it's going to work. Because remember, I said ALS is very different from person to person, and people's response will be different. And that will come from the community, the patient community, to kind of fill in that gap of whether that's acceptable or not. And last is, I told you about the site struggle. So the site struggle in expanded access, we haven't, as Phil mentioned, expanded access is not commonly employed in ALS, and that's for a variety of reasons. One, I believe that there's a lot of smaller companies involved. And so when they have tight resources and tight funding, or tight drug supply, it becomes difficult to implement an expanded access. But my opinion is that if a drug company comes into the ALS space and they're considering it, that has to be part of their thought process when they decide to enter into that indication, that they need to get that right off the bat. And so hopefully going forward, that would be the case. The second is trying to balance, many of the ALS centers are small, we're small teams. And so if we're doing clinical care, we're doing clinical trials, adding EAP, will there be a pull on resources? Will our teams doing EAP, will my clinical trials team be diverted to EAP so that it will slow down clinical trials? And so the funding at the sites and personnel will be important to build up the infrastructure to support both. And I think that would be possible, but it has to be done thoughtfully. And the last is, a lot of experimental therapies are becoming much more intricate in the way they're administered. Beyond oral medications and IV even, some are hospital administered. So if there is something that's offered through EAP that requires me to have a lumbar puncture done and placed into the spinal fluid, I have to use the hospital facility. So typically EAP has no funding. And if the hospital is not willing to give me that for free to use, there's no way for that to be covered. The second is the procedure itself and who's going to do it and how that's going to be funded. Usually that's volunteer time. And the last is that if a therapy is not approved by the FDA, it's considered investigational. Usually they get shipped to the site. And even if the company provides it to the site, they can ship it, but it has to be stored in a research pharmacy, which is a pharmacy that requires controls of temperature, storage, and accountability, all of this, which is cost, which drives cost, and those things are usually not covered. And so that becomes very complicated. And I think this is where probably the Act for ALS came up as to address some of these issues. So I think from my perspective, the landscape has evolved such that, and I think the community has educated itself such that from the researcher standpoint, I think there's an understanding from all of us that clinical trials is the way to understand true efficacy of an investigational drug. But how can we do this in parallel to being respectful to people living with the disease, gaining access and gaining evidence at the same time? And there it is a balance, and it does require some thought, and there are challenges that our community will face. But I think from the clinician perspective, that's kind of the environment I'm living in right now.
Thank you, Jinsy. And we're setting up nicely for the policy debate, or not debate, excuse me, discussion, as we see a disease impacting, a terrible disease impacting a relatively small number of individuals relative to the whole population. The science, in a way, limited in funding until perhaps this new legislation pops through, but many people willing to be in science, and at the same time, not so many slots to give them. Not clear yet where Jinsy or anybody really thinks the state of the science is, but we'll come back to that in terms of, could you use more subjects, or what could you really learn given where we are? So that allows for a nice transition to some thinking about policy. So I'll turn that to Holly.
Great, and thank you. This is a hard group of acts to follow, and I hope it won't be too repetitive. But as Art mentioned, I've been asked to make some remarks about how we should think about balancing access and evidence from a policy perspective. And I'm not a policymaker myself. I study policy, so it will be with that kind of framing that I'll make the next couple of remarks. Right, but I think the key thing about what policymakers are being asked to do in this context is balance the needs of individuals, patients who are looking for access today, and populations of patients, right? So, we have to think about patients who are not even yet diagnosed, right? And think about kind of the progress of the science and the drug development and the evidence development over time. And so I think this raises a question about whether the interests of individuals and patient populations are always aligned, or how to make them as well aligned as they possibly can be, right? The current patients, as Greg laid it out, are not only interested in access, right? Obviously, evidence about things that work would be ideal, but they may have a heightened interest in access in relation to evidence compared to kind of patient populations if we think longitudinally over time, right? So if I'm a patient, I've been recently diagnosed with a serious and life-threatening condition that's currently lacking any good treatment options, what are my interests, right? I want to get better. And I also might want to help others, right? And I can merge those goals by being in a trial. But it's now been said many times over the course of this day, of course, not everybody can be in a trial, right? There may not be enough slots. You may live too far away from a trial site. You may not have been diagnosed at the right window to allow you to enroll in one of these studies. And so then I have typically thought of this as kind of a dichotomous scenario in which the options are expanded access or pushing for early approval. And I'd like us to spend some time in the Q&A thinking about this kind of third option that Phil has dubbed expanded access research, right? Which might kind of fall in the middle, and to think about what we'll be able to get from that kind of hybrid species between the two, the two ends of the spectrum. Now, expanded access has this wonderful benefit of by law not interfering with trials. And that is so critical, right? I mean, again, we've heard time and time today that evidence is so important to figuring out what we should push to market and what payers should be willing to pay for, right? So that kind of pushing things to the expanded access side versus the early approval side is really valuable in preserving the ability to generate evidence. But we've also been hearing about all of these logistical constraints, right? So Jinsy has laid them out from the hospital perspective and the provider perspective. We've heard from others what the difficulties are from the patient perspective of getting access through this pathway. And I think that a lot of this can boil down to financial questions about who should be expected to pay for expanded access. Right. So I hear Greg saying, we should hold companies' feet to the fire. And I think that is more true when you have a well-established pharma company that has the resources to make these things available, and more difficult when you're dealing, with some of the companies that we've heard use as examples here that don't have any products yet approved. And if we say to them, well, if you want to enter the ALS space, for example, you have to be able to figure out how to provide large-scale expanded access programs, is that going to scare them away, right? What are the unintended consequences of pushing companies, which are for-profit ventures, right? Which is how we've set up the pharmaceutical system in this country, to say you have to find a way to provide access for free. Well, for how many people, for how long should expanded access be provided, right? So I think those are really important logistical constraints that then turn into ethical questions, right? What proportion of your resources should be spent on this versus other things? We know even big companies like Biogen, I'm going to raise them as an example since I've seen them come up in the chat, raising questions about, is it okay to give a patient expanded access when others are getting a placebo in the context of a trial, right? These are questions that are open as a debate, right? We have our different views on them, I think. We'll probably talk about those during the Q&A, but I don't think those are resolved questions necessarily. We can get at some of those logistical problems and financial constraints through endeavors like Act for ALS, finding ways to pay for this expanded access research. But it is not going to be a panacea, right? There are still going to be some patients who are not eligible for a trial, not able to, find one of these expanded access slots. And so what do we do in those circumstances? And as Greg indicated, that kind of need, right, that unmet need is what causes patient organizations and advocates to, in some cases, push for early product approval. And I hope that we can talk more about the Aduhelm example in Alzheimer's disease as kind of the quintessential case of problems with moving too quickly toward approval, right? So if you try to push approval too quickly before you know what the product works, it becomes very difficult to force companies to gather that information in a rigorous way once the product is already on the market. Their incentives change. It's possible that the incentives of patients change, right? Whether they will be willing to participate in a study versus asking their doctor to prescribe them the medicine, as is typically the case once a product gets approved, right? And so that ultimately has downstream effects on not only the company that got its drug approved, but on other companies who might say, oh, we have a lower standard of evidence now, right? The statutory standard is the same, but FDA has said we will accept weaker evidence. And so what's their motivation to get stronger evidence? Well, their motivation could be that payers refuse to pay. And so then that doesn't actually solve this access problem, right? If you get products on the market without being able to pay for them. And so this is kind of my final point here, is that we do have to address these concerns about figuring out how to pay for things before we know that they work. That problem comes up in the expanded access side of things when we think about who should pay, and it's going to come up on the early approval side of things when we think about who should pay. So my push, and I think this is obvious from things I've said elsewhere and published, is that we need to focus on improving expanded access. That's the kind of basket that we should be putting our eggs in. It is not perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but I'm most hopeful that we can make a meaningful difference there, right? We might be able to gather more research information from expanded access patients so that these data that would otherwise be lost can be kind of roped in and used, and we can learn from them. But it's going to make us answer some really important questions that we have not yet resolved in expanded access. And I think, one of the big things that we haven't resolved is what counts as successful expanded access. How big should an expanded access program be? For how long should it run, right? So is it the case that we should say, we have failed unless every patient who lacks access to an approved therapy can be in a clinical trial or get expanded access, right? Is that the ultimate goal? If it is, right, we should be very clear about that goal. And we need to think about some of the resource constraints that will be associated with achieving that goal. So let me pause there. I don't want to take too much more time, but I'd like to come back to ACT for ALS if we do have some time to get to it.
Very good. Thank you, Holly. So Suzanne, you're a payer involved in making some hard decisions that way. Many Americans assume that all needs and every whim is met in the Canadian provincial health systems. Others say nobody would go there because everyone's standing in a 2-mile line in blizzards waiting to see a primary care person. So I'm sure you can straighten that out for us easily. But more seriously, I think you've had a lot of experience in the space here with regard to thinking about these payment issues. So why don't you take the floor?
Thanks very much. And I just want to thank everyone. I've learned so much from all of you collectively today. This is one of the most thoughtful events that I've had the opportunity to participate in. So, I think both Jinsy and Holly, from very differing perspectives, have highlighted the challenge when we're dealing in the space of rare diseases. And it is about defining what is the right exception. And maybe just to start at the top about being a payer. I'm currently a health technology assessment organization, but I was a payer for the better part of 7 years. And I think just to put in context what that means is it means just like each one of you have to make choices each day about where you spend your money. That's what governments have to do. And they assign budgets based on the economy and what they're predicting. And as a payer, as Jinsy said, much like a clinician, and I know that's a strange analogy, but it is about looking at not just the individual in front of me requesting a particular medicine, but it's those that are already on the program, those that have common and usual diseases, those with cancer, those with less common diseases, those with rare diseases and ultra rare diseases. And the phrases that get used when I talk to people are, if I'm not funded this drug, it's affecting my quality of life, my ability to work. These medicines are life enabling. Without these medicines, my life will be altered forever. I have a life-threatening disease, whether that's days, months, or years. And there's tragic, awful diseases where both the nature of the illness and the nature of the death are terrible. And as a result, all of those things go into making up the conversations that we have to have as payers. And just to put it a little bit in context, and again, this is a Canadian context, largest program publicly funded in Canada. When I left, we were spending about $6.6 billion in our program. So a 1% increase was $66 million. In that same year, our number of seniors grew by 3.6%. So again, we have to pay for all of the new individuals that are coming on. In that same year, I had 20 groups come to me who had rare disease circumstances about wanting new drugs that were in the pipeline. In Canada, for the first time this past year, the top 5 drugs that are being paid for are rare diseases. They have now edged out all common diseases like diabetes, cardiac, the hepatitis C drugs that we thought would never be able to be covered by public drug plans. And at the same time, we're now seeing a shift where of all of the monies being spent, we're spending about 60% of our dollars on less than 5% of the population. Those are important things for us to think about going forward. And it's certainly not because people don't want to be able to provide supports for individuals with all diseases. But even within health, and I think, Jinsy, you best described this, and perhaps the most top of mind example for me is the change we saw in the care for individuals with spinal muscular atrophy over a very short window of time. Those first drugs needed ICU, pediatric ICUs for admission. Those resources didn't exist in the hospital. You know, did they have to raise foundational monies for them? And again, we're talking just within talking about the pharmaceuticals in a narrow population. But COVID has also taught us that there's many populations that aren't getting care, whether it's mental health, whether it's in long-term care, whether it's supportive care at home. And I don't know all of your individual health stressors in your system, but all of them require us to make choices. And for us to be able to do those, we have to actually kind of draw some lines in the sand. And I think that's where it becomes challenging. Are those lines, should those lines look the same for everyone? How promising does a medicine have to be? What is the exception? I've been in the circumstance, and I know Andrew knows this well. You know, I've tried to have conversations with rare disease advocates. If you had to sort into a pile, what are the most rare, most difficult diseases to manage? Can we start with those? And there's no one willing to have those difficult conversations. I will say, though, that there's also risks that aren't talked about from payer perspectives. And these often sometimes overlap with the industry. You know, it is governments are readily sued. It's a highly litigious environment. There are precedents that are set, whether they're set and asked for by patients. If patient with disease A got access to X, then patient with disease B should get access to Y. We also have manufacturers who will say, if we've been able to make an exception in one circumstance, we should be able to make it in all. The unintended consequences of the expanded access provisions to negotiations. What happens to the expanded access patients? We've seen that in Canada, where manufacturers have in fact been supporting patients during some periods of time. And then the moment that the drug becomes available in Canada, it's presumed that payers will pick up all of the costs for those patients, even in advance of assessments of how good they're working from an efficacy, or from a perspective of hampering the negotiations to be able to get them on our formulary. And I think all of you, and one of the speakers this morning touched on this, it's very hard for all of us to do this work within a political environment, within media. And I think some of the expanded access choices have even been impacted in recent years by social media. It used to be that you could have conversations and try and identify those patients that would most benefit, were at most immediate risk. And now, as many of your speakers in the chat, you know, and Philip, you've flagged this as well, not enough seats on the bus. So how can we do it all? You know, I thought that Gary and Richard highlighted the tensions really well. One of the things, a couple of the things that I've thought about over the years, and I think people always presume that the payers don't like pharma industry. And I just want to, you know, validate that we love pharma industry. I think all of us know that the value that the industry brings, not just to individual patients, but the economy, and you know, in so many ways. And there must be ways for us to be able to start to identify new ways for us to support industry. whether it's something I've always talked about a good housekeeping seal of approval. I've talked about social investing like we saw in the fossil fuel industry. What is it that we can do that actually incent the industry to support social responsibility and do their jobs and get recognized for it, and not just be criticized for the difficult choices that have to be made? But I think for all of us, it's trying to find that balance between looking for unicorns in the data and looking for the dragons that are in there as well. It is really important for us to weigh both sides. And when you're an individual facing a life-threatening illness, there's nothing that could feel worse than these conversations going on around you. And I just would say from a payer perspective, if we could wave a magic wand and be able to fund everything, we would. But I think we are all at a point where we do have to make choices, whether they're from a clinician perspective, from a policy perspective, or from a financial perspective. And we have to find a way to be able to have those conversations thoughtfully. And I would say this certainly is one of the best environments I've ever seen for that.
Well, maybe we should just end on that note, but unfortunately, I've got some more miserable questions for you. I'm also watching a little bit into the chat box now. Remember, you can use that for questions. So here's my first tough one, kind of for Jinsy, kind of for Phil, but anybody can weigh in. So here's some things I hear, and I've heard about ALS for 25 years as a bystander. We're close, we're breaking through, something's going to happen. This looks promising. If we just had another push with money and research, we'd be there. 25 years, at least for my listening to ALS advocates, ALS researchers, people who care for people with ALS when I was at Penn, now moving up to New York. Here's what else I hear. Batten disease, one more push, just a little more money, we could fix that. Lynch syndrome, one more push, little more money, we could really get on top of that. Here's what I don't hear, at least in the US. There are a whole lot of people in horrible nursing homes, wasting away, abandoned, and we know how bad it is because half of the people who died during COVID were in them. Spend some money here. So I'm interested in some comments about promising state of the science. I didn't even get to Holly's favorite at-home thing, but we'll come back there in a minute. But just looking at it from the point of view of how's a payer or someone who's trying to be a good citizen supposed to think in a world of promise, one step away?
I guess I'll go first, and then I'll have everyone else fill in, and I'll stay away from the Agile Helm situation and stick to my lane in ALS. It's true that it's true that we have been hearing these kind of breakthroughs each year for many years, and actually since Riluzole, there was this great hope. Riluzole was approved in the late 90s here in the US and now is available globally. And that was actually developed based on a mouse model that people were able to create, the transgenic SOD1 mouse model. And we thought, oh, we're going to learn a lot about the biology. And what's happened is we've tested a lot of drugs in that mouse model. It didn't translate into the human clinical trials. So we learned. And what we learned is that the disease itself is very heterogeneous. And we've slowly learned after doing clinical trials, after each clinical trial, we learn a little bit more about the biology. And even in my time in practice for just over 15 years, we've learned, I could only test for SOD1 in the beginning in 2005. Today I can test for almost 25 genes commercially. So our knowledge does grow. But what I said is in my session is the more we learn, the more we realize we don't know. And that's part of it. And the other limitation, I think, which is under perceived, is that, I think there has been a lot of philanthropic donations and nonprofit funds that have tried to help push things along. But often, and even government grants, but they're very resource constrained, and of course, Suzanne can talk a lot about that. But in those constraints, we try to do clinical trials and build repositories and build data collections, and they are restricted and small. And it's clear that in ALS, a clinical trial is only 100, 200, several hundreds patients big. But there are far more people living with that disease at that particular moment in time. And so in order to really understand the biology in a very complex and heterogeneous disease, we will have to have big big collections of data. And that's where this kind of EAP push is coming from.
Phil, what do you say to those who say the science isn't really there yet? It's a weird time to ask society to push resources, let's say in the ALS direction, but it could be toward any disease group that's trying to, drive money, resources, seats on the bus to people.
So I think we need to balance the long-term science with the short-term support, and leverage the people that are living with the disease today to try and learn more about the heterogeneity of the disease. As Jinsy mentioned, even in the 3 years that I've been living with the disease, things have changed so much on the science side and the understanding and how important TDP 43 is now in the pathology of the disease. Whereas 5 years ago, that probably wasn't being talked about. So I think the more that we can learn from and identify different subtypes, because it's clear that there are subgroups or subtypes of ALS. And if we can start identifying that pretty readily in people living with the disease, now we can segment trials properly, have more effective trials, and then understand who the therapies work for. And we can gain this knowledge today by providing access to the broader community and then collecting that data. And then we can have natural history studies and other basic bench science that will take years, but will help us better understand the biology and the fundamental mechanisms. But first, we need to better understand what the disease is and who has what. So I think that can start with getting access to therapies to a broader population and seeing what happens. And to me, that it's a necessary part of the research. And yes, the access is important. It gives us hope, but it also is going to give us some very valuable information.
So let me drive in a slightly different direction for a second. Here's something that I have seen in my experience with expanded access, or telling companies to get ready to carry more free access or build more clinical space. It's the investors, not the drug company. You have little startup companies talking to a bunch of people who want to make some money, and you go there and you start raising the cost of entering the space, and they're not going to come in. Will they, Jinsy?
This is actually a real issue. I mean, Holly touched on it a little bit about, if we start saying to small entities, you have to be prepared to scale up, you will have to prepare drug supply, and that will drive costs and increase the cost of the entire development program. It might scare people away. But I actually think that the companies that are invested in the space in ALS, for the most part, have been genuinely interested in making a difference in the disease. And how I kind of counter that is that there will be contribution to the science and the knowledge in being in that space, because it's essentially uncharted territory. And when in doing that, they may improve the understanding of clinical progressions or subtypes, or help, someone asked me, how can drug companies help the infrastructure? I mean, creating and supporting repositories for samples, because those are very hard to maintain. And usually there's very few funders that are willing to fund the infrastructure to maintain. We collect a whole bunch of samples and then no one will help to maintain the infrastructure for the repository in the United States. The second is creating a unified clinical collection of database for clinical data, so that, you know, if we do an EAP, that tool could be useful in other diseases, other entities, maybe profitable for them, but also helps us standardize the collection of data, make sure we don't lose it, like Richard was saying in the section before. And the last is creating these trial forecasts in the competitive landscape, so they know what they're entering into. And that can also help the EAP program also understand who would be quote unquote not clinical trial eligible in ALS, but also for them in other disease areas as well. I mean, I'm throwing things out there, I'm thinking on my feet a little bit, but you know, we have to counter that because we don't want to scare people away from ALS. We need as many people from wherever, whether it's a payer, whether it's a regulator, whether it's a manufacturer, to be in the space, because we need all hands on deck.
So Holly, hyper rare diseases or hyper rare subtypes of ALS disease, whichever, it doesn't matter. It still looks to me, in the US context, somewhat Canada, squeaky wheels get greased. If you can organize a campaign, if you know how to reach the payer, if you know how to get in the media, if you can put forward touching cases of people in trouble, and there are many people in trouble who don't want to be in the media or be the touching case, or embarrassed by their disease, mental health, urinary incontinence. I can think of a bunch of them where they're not going to go tell their story. It's even hard to do it with suicide. How do we balance that against the needs to try and drive, let's call it promising research forward?
Yeah, I mean, I was talking with some folks in the chat about this question, and Art, you know, I don't have to describe this to you, but in ethics, we talk about leveling up and leveling down when we see inequities, right? So what I mean by that is we can either, you know, give everyone more to increase fairness if we think that more is what is, you know, ethically owed, or we can say, oh, well, there's unfairness in the world, and so we can level down. We can knock people down and say, oh, well, you shouldn't have access to this thing, so nobody can have access to it. And leveling down is, you know, unsurprisingly viewed as problematic, right? Instead, we have to, I think, do a better job figuring out what the appropriate ethical baseline is, which is why I was asking these questions about what's the right size of expanded access or the right scope of expanded access, because that needs to set the bar so that we can say everyone deserves this, right? Regardless of whether they have strong advocates behind them or legislative attention or, you know, whatever it is, you know, a cute child or whatever kind of gets people excited on a social media campaign, right? We can say, this is the baseline we expect everybody to meet. And I don't think that we have done a good job clearly articulating what that baseline is in the context of expanded access, because historically, although Greg will correct me if I'm wrong about this, if we set HIV aside, where, you know, there were larger programs, I think more recently, expanded access has been treated as this exceptional model, right? It's, you know, we've got single patient expanded access, we have intermediate populations, we have the possibility to do, you know, widespread treatment protocols, but it is intended, you know, or at least it's been used in this kind of one-off kind of way, right? And if we want to change that, I think we have to figure out, well, what's the ethical argument for changing that? It's that people have an unmet treatment need and they can't access a product before FDA has given it approval, right? But then, you know, I apologize for talking in circles, but then we have to figure out a way to pay for it, right? The baseline, you know, it has to be something that's reasonable and feasible, right? So we have to have a way to pay for it. We have to have companies on board. We have to have regulators on board. I think, you know, those things are all possible, but we have to know what we're holding people's feet to the fire about. And I don't think we've established that yet.
So thank you, Holly. Suzanne, I've got a different kind of question for you. So you're looking at payment decisions, and we know that data is often missing or partial or incomplete. We also know that there are people out there certainly are in the United States, but I think it's true in Canada too, who can't get access to proven treatments. In the US, there are plenty of people who couldn't get access easily to certain medicines because they don't have health insurance. We fight about dentistry. I've mentioned long-term care. how do you weigh the proven against the, if you will, promising?
So a great question. And I'm really fortunate, at least in the pharmaceutical space, and sort of the devices and medical technologies, where I sit now, just for the last 18 months, is in what's called a health technology assessment organization. And so in Canada, all of the decision makers, and I'll jump back to one of your earlier questions in just a sec, look to have the HTA bodies actually do a review of all of the products. They can be done simultaneously if the drug manufacturers give us the information while they're going through the regulatory process. And in that case, it means often that we can provide our guidance to the payers shortly after the drug has been approved for market. And what we do in those cases are answer some of the questions and some of the things that are happening in the chat. We look at the product from people usually associate health technology assessment with only being cost effective. What is the opportunity cost? So if we pay for this product, what aren't we paying for in long-term care, in another part of the healthcare system? We also look at it from an ethical perspective. We look at it from a clinical perspective. We look at it from legal perspectives. And we have a panel of clinicians and experts who deliberate after having presentations of the information, dossiers put together by the industry, patient input, and specialists. And they deliberate and provide recommendations to our drug plans about whether they should or shouldn't be funding these drugs. Often the advice is to fund if there's sufficient clinical evidence, and there may be conditions about how narrow the coverage should be, i.e. which patients, or it may be conditions about if they're negotiating, what should their price point try to be if it's actually going to meet a cost effectiveness threshold. That also happens in medical devices, et cetera. But within governments, as an example, people often think that governments are siloed. We certainly have probably no different silos than happen within hospitals or happen within pharma industry. But we do all sit around the table and have to make decisions about the aliquot of money we have and where should it go. And the better the evidence and the stronger the information that suggests that we'll have a positive outcome, the easier it is to fund because you're using scarce resources to be able to fund it. The analogy I often give is if you were sitting on a board of a hospital and you were receiving reports that said you were doing 100 surveys for a particular type of surgery, and less than 20% of them were successful, would you continue to fund those surgeries? And as a board member with a fiduciary responsibility for the stability and the ongoing care that your hospital provides, you'd have to make difficult choices. And I think that's sometimes where we struggle, is that we really are looking at, the story. And you asked the question about social media and people being, the case that's in front of everyone. And I'm a mother, I'm a grandmother. I read the newspapers, I watch social media just like everyone else. And the challenge that we ran into in Ontario was that those decisions were being, at a point in time in the past, driven by relationships between industry, the loudest voice. I think you called it the squeaky wheel. I held a very, I was fortunate to hold a very interesting position in the province of Ontario, where it was me personally that made the decisions about what drugs came on or off. Not randomly, I had lots of advice and lots of experience, but it was not the government that made those choices. Now, it did not mean that I could spend more money than the government allocated to the drug program, but it did allow for a bit more confidence that it wasn't just the squeakiest wheel. Now, I would also say that, in all of the positions we're in, we have to be able to have the same hard conversations that Jinsy has with patients. When I first started in the program, we didn't meet with patients. I quite regularly met individually with patients, patient advocates, and had to have the same conversations with them. And I will tell you, my most remarkable conversation was with a very thoughtful woman with a daughter with SMA. And she said to me, Suzanne, at this point, I used to understand why, people, might have private insurance, might be able to go out and pay for things. They could sell their house, move into somewhere new. But for me to be able to afford the products that are being made available for my daughter, I would have to sell everything I owned every single year to be able to just afford it. And those become untenable situations for private insurers, for public payers, and individual people. It's a really important dialogue we're having.
So I've got, I think Richard's around. Greg, are you still with us too? Yes, there he is. Okay. So now I'm going to toss out another intentionally disturbing question to anybody who wants to go after it. So this morning, I heard that a lot of the data that might come out of EAP programs might not be that useful and people are wary of it. Let's put it that way. Maybe useful as supplemental data to trials, but not something that would replace them. There's that case lying around of our favorite Alzheimer's disease drug that says, take some surrogate endpoints and incomplete studies and start distributing. What would make data from EAP programs, if that's one path we want to take, doable? I heard Jinsy say coordinate, standardize, make sure you've got exchange that's open. And I'm thinking to myself, really, in the competitive dog eat dog academic world we're in, they're going to go share? Are we shutting down the tech transfer office tomorrow? Might be ideal, but is that going to happen? So why, if I'm going to go down the EAP path, one, why should I trust it? Because it looks like it produces perhaps dubious decisions like Adahelm. Or two, what would I have to do to pay, and who's going to pay to make EAP useful, doable? All right, the next question. No, go ahead, think about that for a minute.
Arthur, I'm happy to jump in just because there was a similar question in the chat. I guess I would say it is a bit of a conundrum. I think there's twofold. There are privacy considerations that, at least here in Canada, make data sharing separate and apart from the pharma industry very difficult, even what we collect in our publicly funded system. So I think there needs to be much greater efforts in that space. But I think to the question about, do we trust information? And I think that there isn't a common understanding now of what are the standards, what's being collected, who's owning them. I would say there continues to be a skew about whether data collected by industry or for industry is valuable. I am one of the people that finds that a bit of a novel observation, since our regulators work on the data that's provided by the industry. So I do think there is far more that we could be doing, but I do think coming to some common understanding about who's doing what and how. And I do think, at least here in Canada and within our organization, we're seeing much greater openness to sharing of data and evidence. But I do think industry needs to, open the kimono further. The amount of redactions and things that need to be done to be able to do the work we do actually is probably hampering the efforts of other people to bring new products together forward. And I think those are some of the things that are blocking the success of promising therapies, if we could learn more from each other more quickly.
I think I'll add just the observation about that data sharing. So I did actually, from the industry side, try to kind of bring the academic and industry together so that during the clinical trial, there's parallel sample collections and data collections that would be put into this consortia, like this academic consortia database. And I wanted to pull from global, not just the US. And I did run into a lot of stumbling blocks about exporting blood samples across country lines, and also differing data sharing policies and privacy issues about clinical data collected in different regions. So that was a healthy challenge, but it didn't stop it from actually occurring. We eventually got through it, but in regions, I think so, Europe and then Canada and maybe US could collect. So we have been successful in the ALS space in trying to create data sharing. Those transfer agreements are a nightmare. And sometimes we've managed to get around them a little bit by having the consortia be the holder of the data, which doesn't have these transfer agreements, and have the universities provide it. And then the owner is actually the consortia, and it's funded by industry. So we've done workarounds, but it does take, I have to say personally, I'm the chair of the ALS Clinical Trial Consortia at this point, and it had taken an enormous amount of time and legal counsel which is volunteered, to figure it out, to create a workaround. And so I wish that was easier. But to answer, I think Heidi had posted a question in the chat about, like, do people really share? In the ALS space, it's true that in different disease states, it might be different, but in the ALS space, we've come to the terms that we need to share in order to create bigger data. And so even industry has been willing to provide their clinical data in a database called PROACT, but also trying to help collect data samples. And the only stipulation is sometimes if a drug is in development and they're right in the middle of their trial, they may not release that data until they're sure that they're not going to go further or they've completed that phase. So sometimes there's time stipulations on it, but they provide it for free. And a lot of the future clinical trials that will be coming are modeled based on the data that's been collected over the years through this PROACT database.
So let me add, the ALS situation that Jinsy's describing may be better. I know many situations where people are sitting on data until they get it published, sitting on data till the intellectual property office at their place signs off. It is not the case that patient interests necessarily come first in the collection of data. But I want to ask, I think Greg and Phil, Greg a little bit from history. Phil, you know, when people outside ALS look at the legislation, I'll confess to this, and Holly may have a word on this too. What's the duty of ALS if they're well organized and can drive legislation home to bring other diseases, rare conditions along with it? Used to hear every once in a while back in the day, I used to moan, I don't think I moaned at Greg, but I moaned at various ALS advocates, fix the damn system. What you're complaining about often is just a broken system. So bring others with you. And I'm curious what you think is your duty to do that when you're sick and your friends are dying and you're just trying to, you know, help yourself and your family versus, you know, a broken system and I got to make sure that everybody comes with me as best I can.
Yeah, I think one, we can show or, you know, demonstrate how a process can be followed to achieve what that goal, that end goal is. More specifically around other neurodegenerative diseases, we really truly believe that the more we learn about ALS, the more we will also discover around Parkinson's and other neurodegenerative diseases. So we're just a little selfish and just first let's start with us, and then hopefully the knowledge gained there will inform, you know, the other Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, etc. So I really truly believe it's a model that other disease indications can follow. We felt that we were not ignored, but not getting the attention that we deserve. I always look back, and Lou Gehrig was diagnosed over 80 years ago. If he were diagnosed today, he would have pretty much the same prognosis, and that's pretty sad. So I think we need a little more attention on this disease, and I think we're making good strides with Act for ALS. And now it's just a matter of working closely with all the stakeholders to put together a super solid implementation of the law, because that's going to be key. And it doesn't start and end with HHS, NIH, and FDA. We need to include the voices of sponsors, people living with the disease, so that what we're building makes sense for the entire system.
Can I just
Greg,
add, I don't actually.
Holly, you got a minute?
Sorry,
and then I'll let Greg go a minute.
I'll be very quick. I actually have given this quite a bit of thought after learning more about Act for ALS. And I don't think that this is a selfish pathway, right? It makes perfect sense for people with a particular interest to pursue their interest. That doesn't mean it's selfish. And I worry that, not that you were intending to do this, right? But I worry that painting it with that brushstroke has us move our focus away from the obligations of the government and regulators and legislators to say, okay, you have identified this problem for us. We see it in your disease area, right? But it is our obligation to identify this as a system problem and recognize that the solution might need to be broader than this particular area, right? And we were seeing it in COVID where we, are putting these obligations on individuals that ought to be responsibilities of the government and, policymakers. And so I think, yes, Act for ALS can be a model for other disease areas, but it's not on the ALS community to, push that. It should be, look, we've spotted this problem and policymakers need to do better across the
Last
across
word
the field.
to Greg, you agree with that? Is that strike moral
So-
equivalence?
So I don't think we should be squabbling for crumbs from the table. And that's what all disease groups have to do, right? And we just want to tell a quick story. Back in the mid-90s, we were fighting with Parkinson's and the Heart Disease Foundation because they were all saying AIDS gets too much money, right? Because we were able to advocate for ourselves and get a large chunk of the NH pie. Christopher Reeve, Superman, appeared literally in the halls of Congress, pulled us all together and said, stop it, right? There's more than enough resources in the federal government and in our economy to double the NIH budget. And so the point is that we need to go for the superstructures that try to drive us apart and pit us against each other, whether it's ALS or AIDS or cancer or Parkinson's, and say that we need to fix the system, as you were saying, Art. But the template of Act for ALS, whether it's parallel track back 30 years ago, these are templates for a larger structural reforms in drug development and drug approval. And we've got to stop begging for crumbs from the table.
I couldn't agree more.